I never thought my story would begin with a bet, a cruel, shallow bet made at a glittering party where I was nothing more than a name tossed casually into a game played by arrogant men. My name is Chloe Richards. I'm 31 years old, and though I never considered myself fragile, nothing could have prepared me for the day I became both a pawn and the player in a dangerous game of pride, betrayal, and revenge. Lucas Marshall was everything the world admired and everything I secretly despised: wealthy, untouchable, handsome, in a cold, polished way. His face was often plastered on magazine covers, his empire of steel and glass towers stretching across New York. He was the kind of man people envied, the kind who thought life bent to his will. And perhaps it always had, until me. I learned about the bet before he ever approached me. One of his so-called friends, Jack, had whispered it at a party, his voice dripping with mischief. "You wouldn't dare marry a woman like her," Jack said, daring Lucas as he lifted his champagne glass. "6 months, Lucas. Prove you're more than your usual type. Win this and I'll pay you $1 million." The crowd laughed. They thought it was entertainment. They thought I'd never find out. But I did. And when Lucas eventually sat across from me in a luxurious restaurant, his cold blue eyes meeting mine with practiced charm, I already knew every word of their sick little game. I remember that first meeting so vividly. He extended his hand, smooth, calculated, confident. But I didn't melt the way other women probably did. I clasped his palm firmly, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "I know why I'm here. I know about the bet." His eyebrow lifted slightly, just enough to betray his surprise, though he masked it quickly. "And yet, you agreed to meet me," he countered, as though I were the one walking into his trap. I smiled then, not because I found it amusing, but because I knew he had underestimated me. "Let's just say," I replied softly, "I have my own reasons." 6 months. That was the length of the contract. 6 months of pretending to be his wife, 6 months of enduring his arrogance and his attempts at control. But for me, it was more than that. It was 6 months of reclaiming something that had been stolen from me years ago, something he didn't even realize he had taken. My father's business, my family's dignity, my childhood home, all destroyed because of Lucas Marshall's ruthless empire. He didn't remember. Of course he didn't. Men like him never did. But I remembered every detail, and I carried those scars into this marriage like hidden weapons. The wedding itself was cold, like a business deal sealed with signatures rather than vows. I wore white, but not because I felt like a bride. To me, it was armor, a costume for the stage, where the first act of our battle would begin. He looked at me as though he had already won, his smirk betraying his confidence. I looked back at him and smiled sweetly, all the while thinking, "You have no idea who I am. You have no idea what I'm about to do." His penthouse was the kind of place people dreamed about: glass walls reflecting the heartbeat of New York marble floors, furniture that probably cost more than entire houses. But to me, it was nothing more than a prison of gold. The moment I stepped inside, I turned to him and said, "6 months, Lucas. Not a day more." He laughed as though I were some amusing pet refusing to play fetch. "We'll see," he replied. He thought he could bend me like he had bent every other woman, with gifts and trips and diamonds. He thought money was power and power was everything. He thought wrong. The first days were a test for us both. He showered me with jewelry, clothing, private jets, and weekend getaways. Each gift was like a chain disguised as silk, each trip a leash to remind me of my place. But I rejected them all. I returned the dresses unworn, left the jewelry untouched, and sat silently on flights while he tried to parade me like a trophy. "I don't need these things," I would say calmly. My voice was steady, but inside I was boiling. Every rejection chipped at his pride, every calm refusal ignited his anger. I could see it in his clenched jaw, in the way he tightened his grip on his glass of whiskey at night. For the first time, Lucas Marshall wasn't in control, and for the first time, he was afraid. He tried new tactics after that: manipulation, isolation. He canceled my work meetings, cut off contacts, sabotaged any attempt I made at independence. "You don't need a paycheck anymore," he said with a smirk. One night pouring himself another drink. "You have me." I looked at him. Then, my hands trembling, not from fear but from rage, and whispered, "Respect, Lucas. That's what I want. Respect." He laughed bitterly, but I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. He didn't know it yet, but the game was no longer his. It was mine. Still, he pressed harder. He couldn't stand the idea of losing. He believed I was a puzzle to be solved, a fortress to be conquered. And every time he tried, he failed. With each failure, I felt my strength grow. He wasn't breaking me. I was breaking him. And when the moment came when his arrogance blinded him completely, I whispered in the dark, "You think you're in control, Lucas, but you're not. You never were." And for the first time, he looked at me not as a pawn, not as a challenge, but as something he couldn't understand. And that terrified him. The weeks after our wedding unfolded like a dangerous performance, each of us playing roles we thought we understood. Lucas believed he was the director, the puppeteer with strings wrapped around my wrists. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that I was no longer a woman waiting for permission to stand. I had been broken before years earlier when my family lost everything to his empire. And from those ashes, I had already rebuilt myself. He was playing a game with a woman who had nothing left to lose, and that is the most dangerous kind of opponent. At first, I thought I could endure it in silence, simply let the 6 months tick by like a slow-burning fuse until my revenge could ignite. But silence has a way of sharpening anger, of carving it into something sharper than words. Every time he flaunted me in front of his friends, I memorized their laughter. Every time he introduced me as my wife with that mocking smirk, I studied his tone. And every time he whispered, "You'll get used to this," into my ear as he tightened his grip around my waist, I etched the promise deeper into my soul: I would never get used to this. I would destroy him with the very thing he cherished most, his reputation. It was during one of those glittering dinners, seated at a table surrounded by his shallow friends, that I saw the first real crack in his armor. Jack, the man who had started it all with that stupid bet, raised his glass and said, "To Lucas, always proving he can have whatever he wants." The laughter that followed felt like knives slicing through my skin, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I leaned toward Jack with a smile that concealed fire and asked, "Tell me, Jack, what's the price of a man's soul these days? $1 million or less?" The table erupted into awkward silence. Lucas froze, his hand tightening around his glass. His friends exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, I saw Lucas afraid of words, my words. After that night, his behavior changed. He became more careful around me, less sure of his control. I could sense the paranoia creeping into his eyes, the way he studied me when he thought I wasn't looking. He knew I knew too much. He knew that I had something planned, and that terrified him. Still, his pride wouldn't let him retreat. He tried to woo me with softer gestures, breakfasts prepared by private chefs, spontaneous trips to the coast, whispered compliments that sounded foreign on his lips. But I saw through it all. It wasn't love. It wasn't even guilt. It was fear masquerading as affection, an attempt to tame the storm he had accidentally unleashed. In the quiet of the nights when the city lights painted our penthouse in a cold glow, I often stood by the window staring at the skyline that had once belonged to my father's company. I could still see the tower that bore Lucas's name, built from the ruins of what my father had worked for his entire life. That tower was my reminder, my anchor. It told me why I was here, why I endured the charade of being Lucas Marshall's wife. Revenge was no longer just an idea. It was a pulse that beat in time with my own heart. But I will confess something I never thought I would admit. There were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, when I glimpsed a man behind the arrogance. One night, long after midnight, I found him sitting alone in the study, staring at an old photograph tucked between the pages of a book. It was of him, as a boy, standing next to a woman I recognized instantly as his mother. His face was softer, his eyes wide with innocence. He looked nothing like the man who had bet $1 million on my humiliation. For a heartbeat, I wondered if he had been broken too somewhere along the way, twisted by a world that demanded cruelty as currency. I pushed the thought away, burying it beneath layers of rage and purpose. Empathy was a luxury I could not afford. Not when the stakes were this high. Not when my family's name still lay in ashes because of him. But that image of him, vulnerable human, lingered in the corners of my mind like a whisper I refused to hear. The turning point came in the 3rd month. By then I had gathered enough information to strike. I had copies of business records, overheard conversations, even photographs of Lucas and Jack exchanging documents that would ruin them both if they ever saw daylight. I had become a shadow in his world, listening, watching, collecting. Every piece of evidence I gathered was another brick in the wall of his downfall. He thought I was silent, obedient, beaten, but I was building something far greater than he could imagine. Still, the closer I came to exposing him, the heavier the weight became. Revenge is intoxicating, but it is also corrosive. It eats at you, blurring the line between justice and destruction. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if I was becoming like him, calculating, cold, willing to use anyone to win. But then I remembered my father's face, the despair in his eyes before the end, and I knew this wasn't just about me. This was about every person Lucas had crushed under his empire. This was about restoring a name, a legacy, a dignity that had been stolen. One night, as Lucas stood on the balcony sipping his whiskey, I joined him, the city glittering below us. He looked at me with that familiar arrogance and said, "You'll thank me one day for showing you this life." I turned to him, the wind tugging at my hair, and whispered, "No, Lucas. One day you'll thank me for ending yours." For the first time since I'd met him, he had no reply. His glass trembled in his hand, and I knew my moment was coming. By the 4th month, the mask between us had all but disintegrated. What began as a cruel game was now a cold war, fought with whispers, glances, and unspoken threats. Lucas still paraded me at his galas, his hand gripping my waist like a chain, but the laughter of his friends no longer cut me the way it once had. Now I listened, memorizing every careless word, every slip of arrogance. They didn't realize I wasn't his ornament, I was the storm forming behind him, waiting to strike. I had allies, though Lucas didn't know it yet. The journalist Elise, who had once investigated Marshall Enterprises before her story was buried, met me in secret. She taught me how to track shell companies, how to follow the shadow trails of money laundering disguised as consulting fees. Daniel, the consultant who had once handed me coffee when I was at my lowest, helped me understand filings, trusts, and loopholes. Every night after Lucas fell asleep, I spread papers across the marble floor of our penthouse, piecing together the puzzle of his empire, while his chest rose and fell in ignorant rhythm. The deeper I dug, the darker it became. Offshore accounts, kickbacks hidden in charity foundations, a trail of destruction dressed in polished smiles. And yet what hurt most wasn't his corruption, it was the discovery that my family's ruin had been deliberate. Buried in those documents was proof that Lucas himself had orchestrated the hostile takeover that bankrupted my father's company. He had called it strategy. My father had called it betrayal. I called it murder, because that's what it felt like, murder of a man's pride, of his life's work, of his will to live. The night I found that proof, I collapsed onto the floor, shaking. I clutched the papers to my chest and whispered into the silence, "Papa, I will make him pay." My tears stained the ink, but I didn't care. Rage and grief had fused together inside me, and there was no turning back. Lucas must have sensed the shift because his behavior grew erratic. One evening he cornered me in the study, his eyes narrowed, his voice low. "You've changed," he said. "You think I don't see it, but I do. What are you hiding from me?" I met his gaze without flinching. "Maybe I've just finally seen who you really are." He laughed, but it was brittle hollow. "And who am I, Chloe?" "The man who destroys everything he touches," I replied, my voice trembling not with fear but with truth. For the first time, he didn't smirk. His jaw tightened, his eyes flashed, and then he walked away. I had wounded him not with fists, not with fury, but with words that stripped him bare. And I realized then Lucas Marshall feared exposure more than anything else. That fear deepened when the invitations for Lydia Harrington's wedding arrived. His ex-fiancée, the woman he had once nearly married before ambition seduced him away. The irony wasn't lost on me. Another glittering hall, another celebration of power disguised as love. Lucas insisted we attend. "We'll show them what perfection looks like," he said, slipping a diamond necklace around my throat as if to gild his victory. I looked at him in the mirror, the jewels heavy against my skin, and whispered, "Or we'll show them the truth." The night of the wedding, the hall gleamed with chandeliers and silk laughter echoing against marble walls. Whispers followed me as I entered on Lucas's arm, but I held my head high. Let them stare. Let them wonder. My eyes found Olivia Harrington, his ex, and her smile faltered for the briefest second when she saw me. It was the same falter I had seen in Arthur's eyes months before, the crack that reveals the rot beneath the gold. But it was Lucas who trembled that night, though he tried to hide it behind whiskey and charm. He knew I carried something dangerous. He knew the woman at his side was no longer his pawn. As he raised his glass to toast, I leaned close and whispered, "Enjoy this moment, Lucas. It's the last time you'll stand so tall." His hand froze midair, and for a heartbeat I felt powerful, not because of his fear, but because I finally held the truth. I didn't unleash it that night. No, the wedding wasn't the place. Revenge requires patience, precision. But I let him see the fire in my eyes, let him know the storm was closer than ever. Because the sweetest part of revenge isn't the strike itself, it's watching your enemy realize it's coming and knowing they can't stop it. That night, as the music swelled and couples danced, I stood at the edge of the ballroom, my fists clenched, my heart pounding. Lucas thought the bet was still his victory. He thought I was still the woman he could control. But soon he would understand I was the consequence he never saw coming. And when the truth finally came crashing down, it wouldn't just destroy him, it would rewrite everything. The days after the Harrington wedding felt like living inside the eye of a storm, eerily calm, but I could hear the thunder building in the distance. Lucas pretended nothing had changed. He carried on with his smug routine of board meetings, photo ops, and shallow soirees, gripping my waist in public as if to say, "Look what I own." But I noticed the tremor in his hands when he poured his whiskey at night. I noticed the way his eyes flicked toward me when he thought I wasn't watching. He was beginning to realize I wasn't the woman he thought he had bought for 6 months. I was the mirror that reflected every sin he'd tried to bury. By then, Elise and Daniel had everything they needed. Boxes of records, secret recordings, financial trails that tied Lucas to fraud, embezzlement, and even the collapse of my father's company. My nights were no longer spent waiting for sleep. I sat awake studying papers by the dim light of a desk lamp, feeling my father's spirit in every line of ink. The documents were a map of betrayal, and I was determined to follow it to its bitter end. But revenge is never clean. The closer I came to exposing him, the more the shadows in my life began to move. Threatening letters slipped under my door. My phone buzzed with blocked calls, each one hanging up as soon as I answered. Once I returned to the penthouse to find my things rifled through, my drawer left open. My father's old photo frame cracked on the floor. Lucas swore ignorance, but I knew it was him, testing me, warning me. I confronted him one evening in the study. He stood at the bar, ice clinking in his glass, the city lights painting his profile in cold silver. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice low, venom laced in every syllable. "But you're not the first to come after me. And you won't be the last to fail." I stepped closer, holding his gaze with every ounce of strength I had left. "No, Lucas, I won't fail. Because I'm not after your money, I'm after your soul, and that's something you can't buy back." His smirk faltered. For the first time, I saw genuine fear behind his eyes. The breaking point arrived sooner than either of us expected. Elise's article was scheduled to publish a meticulous exposé backed by evidence that would shatter Lucas's empire. On the eve of its release, Lucas threw a gala in his honor, a self-congratulating spectacle meant to remind the world of his untouchable power. Chandeliers glistened, champagne flowed, and the air was thick with arrogance. I stood beside him, dressed in silk that felt more like chains, my heart pounding with the secret I carried. As the speeches began, I slipped away from his side and climbed the steps to the stage. The microphone screeched as I adjusted it, silencing the room. Faces turned toward me, friends, enemies, strangers, all waiting for entertainment. Lucas's smile froze his glass halfway to his lips. I spoke clearly, my voice slicing through the hush. Some of you know me as Lucas Marshall's wife, but what you don't know is that I was also the daughter of the man he destroyed. The company he crushed belonged to my father. The legacy he stole is the reason my family died in shame. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My hands shook, but I held steady. Tonight I stand not as his ornament, not as his conquest, but as the witness to his betrayal. And tomorrow the world will see the proof. Chaos erupted. Guests whispered, phones lit up, reporters surged forward. Lucas stormed the stage, his hand gripping my arm so tightly it burned. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his face pale beneath the lights. But I smiled, leaning close so only he could hear. "You've already lost. You just don't know how loud the fall will be." That night, Elise's article hit every headline. Front pages screamed his crimes. Television anchors dissected his empire, and allies abandoned him like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Within hours, investigations opened. Stock prices plummeted. Contracts dissolved. The man who thought he owned the world was suddenly a prisoner of it. And me. I walked away from that penthouse with nothing but the clothes on my back and the strength I had carved out of suffering. Lucas shouted after me, a broken man scrambling to salvage pride. But his voice no longer held power. It was just noise fading behind me. I had won, or so I thought. Because revenge doesn't end with victory. It lingers in the silence that follows, asking what pieces of yourself you sacrificed to achieve it. And in the quiet days after his empire crumbled, I would have to face that question too. The morning after his empire collapsed, the city felt different. Headlines screamed his downfall, reporters swarmed the courthouse, and the once untouchable Lucas Marshall was suddenly reduced to a man hiding behind tinted car windows and trembling lawyers. I watched it unfold, not from the sidelines, but from the heart of it, because in every camera flash, in every whispered conversation, my name surfaced alongside his. Not as his wife, not as his conquest, but as the woman who brought him down. And yet, when I returned to the tiny apartment I had rented after leaving the penthouse, the silence was suffocating. Victory tasted sharp, almost bitter, like wine left too long to sour. I sat by the window, clutching my father's photograph, and whispered, "It's over, Papa. He can't hurt us anymore." But even as the words left my lips, I felt the ache of all I had lost. Revenge had stripped him, yes, but it had stripped me too. A week later, I was called to testify. The courtroom was grand, heavy with the smell of polished wood and old secrets. Lucas sat at the defense table, his once perfect suit hanging loose on shoulders that seemed smaller now. His eyes met mine only once, and for a flicker of a second, I saw not the monster, but the man, the boy I had glimpsed in that photograph months ago. For a moment, pity stirred in me, fragile and fleeting. But then I remembered the grave of my father, the hollow stare of my mother, and the years I spent erased. My voice did not tremble as I told the truth. When the verdict came, the room gasped. Guilty on multiple counts, his empire dismantled, his fortune seized. Lucas Marshall, the man who thought himself invincible, would spend years behind bars, his legacy forever tarnished. He stared straight ahead as the judge read the sentence, but I saw his hands grip the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. That was the moment I knew the bet, the arrogance, the cruelty, everything had finally caved in on him. Afterward, people called me brave. Survivors reached out, telling me my story gave them strength. But bravery is not what I felt. What I felt was exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones, after years of carrying a weight too heavy for one heart. I walked out of that courtroom into the cold sunlight and realized I wasn't just free of Lucas. I was free of the rage that had chained me to him. Daniel found me outside, his presence steady as always. "It's done," he said softly. I nodded, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. Not because I was sad, not even because I was relieved, but because for the first time in years I felt the possibility of life beyond revenge. I won't lie to you. Healing didn't come overnight. There are still nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing his laughter, feeling his grip. But there are also mornings when I wake to the sound of birds outside my window, sunlight painting the walls, and I realize I survived. I built something out of ruins. I turned my pain into power. And if you've listened to my story this far, maybe it's because some part of you knows what betrayal feels like. Maybe you've been erased, humiliated, broken by someone who thought they held all the power. If that's you, hear me, revenge may satisfy, but healing, that's where freedom lives. Don't let your scars define you. Let them remind you of the battles you've already won. So if my story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment. Tell me your story, your fight, your survival. Because none of us heal alone. And maybe, just maybe, our voices together can be louder than the betrayals that tried to silence us.